For those who may not be overly familiar with the Wheatley Institute, I just wanted to briefly read the mission of the Wheatley Institute so you can kind of get a sense of what Wheatley is all about. Our mission statement is this: as disciples of Jesus Christ, we believe that agency, accountability, charity, morality, and spiritual strength are essential for people to survive, to thrive. As students of history and humanity, we believe such personal virtues can be transformed into civic virtue in the presence of trusted and trustworthy institutions of civil society and the rule of law. Accordingly, Wheatley Institute engages students, scholars, thought leaders, and the public in research-supported work that fortifies the core institutions of the family, religion, and constitutional government. So before I introduce Dr. Carrese, I'd like to invite McKay Winder from Fallon, Nevada, who's a political science major, to give us an opening prayer, and then we'll go from there. Thank you, McKay. You'll notice by your seats there's little papers so that when we get to the Q&A portion, you can just use that QR code and enter in your question, and I'll have them up here on the iPad. So, very pleased today to have Dr. Paul Carrese with us from Arizona State University. BYU loves pioneers, and Dr. Carrese is a bit of a pioneer in higher ed civic education. He is currently the professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, or SCETL, if you prefer the acronym, at ASU, and was its founding director in 2016. So he's the director from 2016 to 2023. He was previously a professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, and co-founded its honors program, which blended liberal arts and leadership education. He is the author of the book, The Cloaking of Power, Montesquieu, Blackstone, and the Rise of Judicial Activism, as well as Democracy in Moderation, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Sustainable Liberalism. He has held fellowships at Oxford, Harvard, University of Delhi, James Madison program at Princeton, and in 2021, he and a few others, in a study that was funded by the NEH and the U.S. Department of Education, put out a report called Educating for American Democracy on how to improve American history and civic education in K through 12 schools. He has a BA in political science from Middlebury College, an MA in politics and philosophy, both from Oxford University's I think is it pronounced Pembroke?
Pembroke.
Pembroke, yes. Not Pembroke. Pembroke College, and has a PhD in political science from Boston College. And a fun note for this group, he is the youngest of 8 children from a good old Northeastern Catholic family. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrese.
Thank you so much, James. It is delightful to be at Brigham Young University. It's delightful to be with the Wheatley Institute. And congratulations to Paul and to Emily and the leadership of the Institute. We have a former president of the university here. Thank you. Friends from Utah Valley University are here, and Brad Wilson, friend and leader of the James Madison program at Princeton University here. So thank you, all of you, for coming, and a happy Constitution Day to all of us. It's a couple days late, but the timing is pretty good. September 17th was the final day of what we call the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. But September 19th is also important in our history because it's the day that George Washington published in a Philadelphia newspaper his shocking statement that he would again resign from public life, retire from public life. So the document that we call the farewell address, which is not the title he gave to it, was published basically as a statement in a Philadelphia newspaper on September 19th, 1796. He had wanted it to be printed on September 17th. The faxes were down, the satellite problem, something like that, and it came out on September 19th. So September 19th is also an important day for us. And I do have to show a prop. There are only a few times in the year that I can wear my U.S. Constitution We the People tie. And so I do have that today as well. We should be grateful that in 2004, United States Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat of West Virginia, proposed legislation to establish Constitution Day, that every educational institution in the country, private or public, receiving any kind of federal funds must have educational programming on or around September 17th to mark the final day of the Constitutional Convention and to celebrate the United States Constitution. After the 9/11/2001 terrorist attacks, there was a resurgence of patriotism and a sense of a common civic culture. But just a few years later, by 2004, there was continuing discussion of the fracturing of our civic culture and also continued concern about a steep decline in basic civic knowledge among many Americans. There was plenty of evidence in 2004 of declining commitment to basic civic principles across all age groups, but especially younger age cohorts. And as we know, that picture has only grown worse across the past 2 decades. In 2004, as James mentioned, I was a civilian professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I was basically hired to teach civic thought and leadership. I was an Athenian in Sparta as an expert on those topics, but I was prepared, looking back, to teach preparation for informed and committed American citizenship. And so I was tasked by the dean in 2005 to organize the first annual Constitution Day lecture at the Air Force Academy. And because the dean was a general, I of course said yes. I had begun teaching at the Air Force Academy a few years before the 2001 attacks. And looking back across a quarter century, I can only hope that the 3 main military academies, West Point, Annapolis, and Air Force, have the same commitment to a blend of liberal arts education and American civic education for all of the officer cadets. It's in their core. I look back at all I learned about America from my military colleagues on the faculty, from the cadets, from learning about the American military culture, about the meaning of America, about our constitutional order, and about our broader civic culture. The crucial fact is that all American officers take an oath to the Constitution, not to the president, not to the chain of command, not to Congress. And so all the academies had figured out there is a need for a liberal arts core that blends liberal arts education and an American civic education. That is necessary to prepare capable citizens and leaders. That's the blend that I tried to bring to Arizona State University in 2016 to found the school that James mentioned, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, to try to restore space in a public university for a higher civics. My theme today is that in order to be competent, serious, and committed citizens of the American Democratic Republic, we must study. We must seriously study in both K-12 schools and in higher education our American political history and the fundamental civic principles, ideals, and debates that produced our constitutional order and sustain it. And my second point is we must study and begin to practice from elementary school through college and university several indispensable civic virtues. Then as adults, we must continue such learning and continue to be committed to these civic virtues. The reason for both of these principles, civic knowledge and civic virtues, is that the United States Constitution presupposes several civic virtues, even if it doesn't specify them. And if we extend the constitutional founding from 1787 to 1791 with the ratification of the Bill of Rights, the presence of these civic virtues implied and called for is even more evident. Take the First Amendment, its protections of free speech, also a right of religious liberty. Both of these suppose a pluralism of ideas and viewpoints and philosophies about politics and about religion. And for such pluralism to work so that there's a diversity of views but not a disintegration of a civic order across a large federal republic, that will require that both everyday citizens as well as leaders in government and public life have the habits, the dispositions, indeed the virtues, the excellences, to constructively handle such diversity and pluralism. It is painfully obvious today, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that a great many Americans don't have these virtues. Indeed, they have never even heard of the idea. A second point about the 1787 Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that while civic virtues are needed among the citizenry that must self-govern under such a complex political order, The Constitution, even as amended, does not empower the federal government to undertake civic education of citizens, to ensure the proper operation of and our civic flourishing under this complex political order. The one exception is professional military education, and that has a national security rationale. And that means that America's challenge, therefore, is that our national motto of e pluribus unum applies not just to the 13 original states, republics, and the later states that come together to forge the federal union. E pluribus unum also applies to the pluralism among our American citizenry. Can we make a unity out of many? Across 3 centuries, we've become the most ethnically, religiously, philosophically diverse republic in all of known history. So how will we meet the aim delineated in the Constitution's preamble to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity if we don't have some minimal degree of common education in what those words mean, in what the Constitution means? Without some parameters or boundaries to the disagreements we can constructively entertain about how to live up to the Constitution and the Declaration. Boundaries certainly to the modes and means of our political discourse. I ask these questions as the current US presidential campaign has seen 2 assassination attempts within 2 months against one of the main 2 candidates. But of course, violent language and violence itself comes from both the left and the right in America today. Ignorant discourse is routine in American politics, but now demonizing and violence also are routine. As educators, as leading citizens, and as all concerned citizens of whatever political leanings, our challenge today is to reprioritize, first, fundamental required civic education in American historical, constitutional, and civic knowledge from K to 16. And then related to this, to rediscover and prioritize education in and experience of several civic virtues. And the 3 most important of these are civil disagreement, civic friendship across divergent political and philosophical views, and a reflective patriotism, arguably the root civic virtue. A reflective patriotism combining love and gratitude for our country with a disposition to argue about and question our distinctive American political order, because it rests on ideas and ideals about justice. I should say a bit more, just to depress you, about the alarming state of American civic knowledge and of our disintegrating civic order. To justify the provocation I've just offered, that professors should care about something as unacademic and unserious as patriotism, let alone care about civic education more broadly. For those with eyes to see, the evidence of our angry polarization and our civic decay is abundant. For educators, this decline was amplified this past year on our campuses, not BYU, but other campuses, with the anti-Israel protests, the occupations, the violence, including open praise of terrorism. We also see a continuing steady fall in public confidence about most American institutions and professions. All, save the military and first responders and small business, now are persistently underwater, so to speak. And that includes higher education and K-12 public education, all deeply distrusted. Further, the surveys and statistics measuring widespread deficits of civic knowledge among Americans of all ages, which have delivered bad news for decades, continue to document our civic decay. Scores for 8th graders in civic and US historical knowledge continue to decline. In 2022, only 22% of 8th graders reach basic proficiency in civics. Only 13% reach basic proficiency in US history. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni, ACTA, recently released a survey revealing the depths of civic ignorance among college and university students. For example, fewer than a third could identify Madison as the father of the Constitution. Only a slightly higher proportion could identify John Roberts as the current Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Nearly 2/3 could not identify the lengths of the terms of the US House and Senate. Such civic ignorance fuels the 2 extremes dominating our civic culture. At the one extreme, the rising appetite for demagoguery and for political violence on both the left and the right. At the other extreme, substantial civic apathy among Americans. And that cedes the civic sphere to the polarized combatants. Multiple recent surveys indicate that while a great majority of older Americans find it essential to live in a democracy and are proud of America, positive responses on those points plummet for those under 30. So America itself is underwater for our younger generations. We might recall the poll from spring of 2022, shortly after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, asking Americans if they would stand and fight, if invaded, as the Ukrainians clearly had fought. For the under 35 answering, a majority replied no. America was not worth it, they would flee or surrender. Gallup recently reported a continued decline in the top tiers of patriotism among all age groups, falling below the level measured in 2000 before the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Only 41% of adults are extremely proud to be American, with 26% being very proud. But that makes for 67% as strongly patriotic. Not great, but okay. In the 18 to 34 age group, a majority is not strongly patriotic. Only 20% are extremely proud to be American, only 24% very proud. What are the causes of this? Well, one is that higher education and relevant disciplines such as political science, my discipline, and history no longer encourage civic spirit, public spirit, patriotism. Presumably on the premise that teaching or promoting patriotism is akin to jingoism, chauvinism, so it's unacademic. Apparently the dominant view among professors is that patriotism is a private choice for students, and further, the foundations of it are a task for K-12 schools, not for higher education. And Gallup's recent findings suggest this attitude. It was in the 18 to 34 cohort that the lowest response on being either very proud to be American among college graduates was the lowest score, 36%. Those with some college or high school degree or less were significantly higher, at 43%, 44% respectively. This academic neglect of, even undermining of, an American patriotism fits with the strong correlation for the past 75 years between declining status of civics in K-12 schools on the one hand, and on the other, the near disappearance of required civics in higher education. And here I should emphasize that while I'm an academic conservative, I raise these concerns, as James mentioned, the only conservative co-author of a bipartisan national consensus study of K-12 civics and history education released in 2021. And the title is Educating for American Democracy. You can find it on the web under that title. The most prominent scholars among the 7 co-authors were Danielle Allen and Jane Kamensky of Harvard and Peter Levine of Tufts. I said to someone, as a conservative in higher education, 6-to-1 odds, that's better than anything I've had for 30 years, so I agreed to join the study. Yeah. The report urges higher education to do its part in rebuilding the entire K-16 ecosystem of civics education. That higher education should supply not just well-prepared school teachers, but a broader citizenry shaped by a required, rigorous American history and civic education for all university and college graduates in both civic knowledge and civic virtues. I got my colleagues to use this language of civic virtues. The EAD report strongly endorses teaching and discussion of the 3 civic virtues I prioritized: civil disagreement, civic friendship, and reflective patriotism. And before I turn to specifically address a reflective or considered patriotism, I should note that during the same period of 2019 to 2021, when we were hashing out and then releasing that EAD report in 2021, 2 prominent higher education leaders confirmed independently this need to reprioritize civic education in higher education. Derek Bach, the former Harvard president, in his 2020 book, Higher Expectations, Can Colleges Teach Students What They Need to Know in the 21st Century? and Ronald Daniels, the president of Johns Hopkins University, in his 2021 book, What Universities Owe Democracy. For Daniels, what we owe is a required civic education in core civic knowledge first, and then in civic virtues, habits, dispositions. It is the least we owe, he argues, to a republic that provides educators so much prosperity and freedom and prominence. And he is exactly right. We can't see angry polarization and political violence and also civic apathy and ignorance, and then say, as professors, not our fault, not our problem. We professors are partly to blame. So what will we do? To understand why a distinctively American patriotism, a reflective, considered, even argumentative love of country, is crucial for the other two civic virtues I've mentioned, we need to rediscover the challenge set for us by the 1787 Constitution and its early amendments. And that's even before the further challenge that comes from the Civil War amendments with their greater emphasis on equality. Simply put, our very complex constitutional forms of separation or distribution of powers and of federalism implicitly call for civil disagreement about both long-term and daily political issues. And these forms also call for civic friendship among Americans across partisan, religious, and philosophical views. Further, both of these are challenging virtues. To hear out people with whom you disagree on policy issues, civil disagreement, and to share a basic civic bond and regard for Americans of divergent first principles or party views, civic friendship. Why would you do this? It's easier to shut our ears, to speak louder, or to tweet and post more outrageously, and to demonize these ignorant, malevolent, un-American people who disagree with my team or my tribe. Our constitutional forms of separation of powers and federalism understand the strengths and weaknesses of human nature and the challenges of liberty and equal political rights better than our current trends in political science and history understand human affairs. Our framers knew that free people always disagree, and they knew that the more democratic and egalitarian a political order, the more likely it was to descend into faction, into demagoguery, into disorder, and ultimately into disintegration. The separation of powers in the federal government and the distribution of powers between state and federal governments, along with the First Amendment protections of speech and other civil discourse, all presuppose a citizenry that will constantly disagree and argue, yet maintain a civil order. So the next order of question is, why be civil in disagreement? Why be civic friends across such deep differences beyond the needs of the constitutional order? Why work within that difficult, complex constitutional order? I suggest that the abstract idea or aim of civic order itself, of preventing disintegration and violence, isn't enough to overcome the everyday, daily passions of politics. That makes a reflective patriotism the root civic virtue, because it motivates us to learn and practice the other civic virtues. Indeed, it motivates us to study American civic knowledge in the first place. And we should note that such a patriotism, especially for the younger folks in the audience, such a patriotism is not mythology or nostalgia. I'm not talking Kung Fu Panda or, other. The older folks in the audience here will know from experience that many everyday citizens and leading Americans knew not long ago how to combine love and gratitude for our country with a disposition to reasonably argue and to question our distinctive American political order. Again, resting on ideals and ideas of justice requires argument. So my proposal to you is only if we are attached to and committed to and grateful to our American constitutional order will we put in the hard work to learn, to disagree constructively, to maintain civic friendship and bonds across deep differences. I pledge allegiance, the school children used to say, and they pledge to the Republic, to the United States of America, to one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. To the extent that any American school children still do say the pledge, they're not pledging to democracy or to activism motivated by grievances. They're not pledging to transformation or to prioritizing their willpower and agency over civic knowledge and civic virtues needed to sustain the republic and our complex constitutionalism. And in fact, we're now learning the costs of neglecting the pledge and other traditional approaches to civic education and to inculcating civic virtues, as we see the extremes now dominating and nearly overwhelming our republic. The violence, the ignorance, and the cocktail of apathy among many with motivated anger among a few on the opposing poles. The classic source for understanding America's reflective, considered patriotism is, in an analytical sense for educators, Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. It was published in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840, based on his visit to America in 1831 to 1832. But I should first note that contemporaneously, a young Abraham Lincoln in 1838 formulates a strikingly similar view of the kind of rational patriotism Americans once had, but, he fears, are losing. Given Lincoln's greatness, this parallel insight gives us further reason to investigate Tocqueville's analysis and his lessons and prescriptions about a reflective patriotism. Lincoln, in his 1838 address to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, entitled On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, diagnoses a descent into violence and lawlessness with arguments over temperance and slavery and other moral political issues. He states that we will never be conquered by a foreign power, but lawlessness and then fear of deepening civil disorder will give an opening, he fears, to the Caesars and Napoleons always lurking within a republic, the ambitious and the demagogues. And so, he says, if we can't stop the descent into anger and disorder, we will die, quote, by suicide. Lincoln warns of this 2 decades before a civil war. But we should note his remedy, a recommitment to civic education and to a rational, constitutionally informed patriotism. Such an education is needed, he argues, particularly by 1838, to replace the fading ties of blood and memory after the passing of the heroes of 1776 and anyone who personally knew that generation. What we need is a cold, rational logic of constitutional education. And yet, he closes by saying that if we recommit to such a rigorous civic education in order to temper our passions and our disagreements, we would bring pride to the great George Washington looking over us from heaven. And, he says, in closing, that this commitment to the great American Republic and experiment in self-government is worthy of a praise second only to that greatest institution, the Christian Church. And so in 1838, just as in the close of his first inaugural in 1861, where Lincoln appeals to the mystic chords of memory and the better angels of our nature after his constitutional and political arguments, in 1838, as in 1861, Lincoln appeals to both head and heart. And in fact, by his second inaugural in 1865, he's appealing almost entirely to the heart, to the biblical faith and the civic virtue resting on it. Neither Tocqueville nor Lincoln knew of the other, but their analyses and prescriptions about American civic culture are strikingly similar. The Frenchman notes that the old world patriotism is only of the heart, it's only sentimental, for blood and soil and for mythic history. But in the New World, the pragmatic American spirit loves America, but it also moves from knowledge of founding ideas on natural rights of individuals to realizing that one's self-interest can only be secured through exercise of civic duties and of self-government. Citizens calculate, he says, they calculate that civic participation and a healthy civic order, political order, will benefit one's own family and friends. Tocqueville focuses on a rational patriotism in the first volume of Democracy in America. But in the second volume of the work, he deems the American pragmatism about civic participation and duties as an enlightened self-interest. In that fuller discussion of the new democratic citizen, he notes that Americans claim to act only on rational and self-interested grounds when they participate in self-government. But in fact, he says, they undertake disinterested and unreflective acts of altruistic, magnanimous conduct. The full picture, as with Lincoln's view, sees Americans blending head and heart, blending rational argument and self-interest with love of country and altruistic commitment to duty. And for Tocqueville, as for Lincoln, a crucial foundation for both love of country and civic altruism. Thus, a foundation for a healthy patriotism and civic culture is Christianity. Early in Democracy in America, Tocqueville identifies America's original point of departure, he calls it, our first founding, as the Puritan blend of religion with commitment to liberty. But later in the work, he warns of a deep danger facing America. The efficacy of our religious founding, he says, is fading. By the work's end, he actually proposes secular and rational remedies to support religious and metaphysical belief. He was anticipating Robert Putnam, the political scientist in recent decades who's written not just Bowling Alone, The Decline of Social or Civic Capital, but also the sequel with David Campbell, American Grace. Between the two books, emphasizing the importance of, but decline in, our civic capital and our religious culture intertwined. Educators today who agree on the basic need for improved, reprioritized civic education should consider the full complexity of what Tocqueville sees as a healthy, rational patriotism and civic culture. But this will require some academic skepticism about our academic skepticism. That is, about our predominant rationalism and secularism. I find in Tocqueville 6 elements of a reflective patriotism, a blending of Christian and classical medieval elements with modern Enlightenment ones. The first that I can see is, as I mentioned, America's Christian point of departure, balancing the spirit of religion, a Christian ethic of love of neighbor, with the spirit of liberty, of self-rule and citizenship. And this point of departure also is the source of the broader American disposition to blend and balance seemingly rival principles. He says only among the Americans is there this balance between a spirit of liberty and a spirit of religion. The second element of a reflective patriotism in his work that he identifies is a rational public spirit arising from the experience of the efficacy of local self-government. Americans blend love of country with each citizen's demand and expectation that America, all the levels of government and community, from local to state to federal, America should benefit self and family. The third element of a reflective patriotism echoes the first, that from 1776 onward, American secular law implicitly incorporates religion as the first political institution, he calls it. That is, America relies on a teaching about mores of political equality and liberty and self-restraint as grounded in metaphysical religious principles of right, of concern for the common good, of shared belief, of hope for the future. The fourth element is American exceptionalism, manifest in the testy pride that Tocqueville encountered about any criticism of America, especially from foreigners, along with Americans professing belief that Americans form the only enlightened and religious and free people in history, succeeding where all other peoples have failed. The fifth element of a reflective patriotism is interest well understood, or as I mentioned, enlightened self-interest. The American philosophy to undertake duties or service not from altruism, but from reasonable expectation that one's family and friends will benefit thereby. And yet again, Tocqueville sees deep American altruism nonetheless. And so he says there are limits to what enlightened self-interest really explains, and there's a need to reinforce the religious grounds of altruism. And finally, the sixth element I can see in his account of a reflective patriotism is schooling and literature and civic culture. From homeschooling to mostly church-run local schools, to elite schooling in classic works of Greek and Latin, to a culture that values poetry. All of these, Tocqueville notes, can and should support the metaphysical and altruistic foundation of a reflective patriotism. And he says, again, that support will be increasingly needed. America's 21st century civic decline, with failing civic knowledge and patriotism in younger cohorts, rising civic ignorance and anger more broadly, all suggest that Tocqueville's prescience about corrosion of the religiously inspired mores that had sustained our reflective patriotism is a serious insight. But are we prepared to consider the remedies that he recommended 180 years ago? Can we confront that what meager civic education remains in America emphasizes only narrow versions of the fifth and sixth elements I mentioned, narrow versions of enlightened self-interest and of schooling? Our elite culture does not prioritize religious or metaphysical belief about loving and serving others as a crucial element of American civic health. Nor does our elite culture emphasize federalism and local self-government, nor a sense of American exceptionalism. Tocqueville does say that an enlightened self-interest of civic duty is better than the degraded life of, as he calls it, individualism and materialism, and the soft despotism of an administrative bureaucracy which he fears Americans will accept or succumb to. But he also tells us, again, that Americans once were better than any rationalist doctrine they offered about their self-interested motives for civic service. So in sum, Tocqueville warns that our reflective patriotism increasingly will need to rely upon what I've called the first and third elements. The first American doctrine, the Christian Republican point of departure. If our patriotism is to survive amid the growing materialism and individualism of the modern democratic and technological era. So by the end of Volume 2, astoundingly, Tocqueville is urging statesmen and thinkers and other leaders to indirectly teach Christian doctrines or metaphysical beliefs in order to perpetuate America's civic and political order. He writes that statesmen and governments must act every day as if they believed in the dogma of the immortality of the soul, by conforming scrupulously to religious morality in great affairs. He argues that this is the only way to ensure that leaders are teaching citizens to know ethical principles and stick to them in everyday matters. Further, he writes, in an age where irreligion and democracy meet in an unhappy convergence, philosophers and those who govern, I'm still quoting, philosophers and those who govern ought constantly to apply themselves to moving back the object of human actions. That is, by teaching citizens that only by resisting little everyday passions will they come to satisfy the general passion for happiness that motivates them. Quote, governments must give back to the people this taste for the future, which is no longer inspired by religion and democracy. And without saying so, they must teach citizens practically every day that wealth, renown, and power are the prizes of work, and that great successes are found at the end of long-lasting desires. And he concludes, such teaching and example from government leaders might rekindle genuine religious belief in Americans. This is 1840. Well, of course, any such thinking is radically divergent from the views predominant in America's elite educational, media, and governing institutions today. And yet many secular academic figures will note the prescience of Tocqueville's diagnosis of dangers facing America's civic culture. And so we should urge them to also consider the countercultural and counter-elite remedies he suggests. I'll close with an example of one effort I made at ASU to restore this metaphysical dimension to American civic education, a pocket constitution, Lincoln on the cover, that adds to the Declaration and the Constitution below the amendments, it adds Lincoln's Gettysburg Address from 1863 and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream Address from 1963. For Lincoln in 1863, 1776 needs a new birth of freedom under God. For Martin Luther King a century later, we need a blending of Christianity and of deep patriotism toward America's founding principles. In effect, we need a blend of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address with the predominantly biblical message of Lincoln's second inaugural. if we are to extirpate the stain of legalized racism from America. So is there any hope today that any such civic education emphasizing these themes, and including rigorous and Socratic discussion and disagreement about them, could be restored in American higher education? I've told you my view that America and American education are not in great shape. But I should close by saying that our situation is not hopeless. So I'll try to avoid both despair on the one hand and naive optimism in closing. What we probably need is some of the grim humor of the late Senator John McCain of Arizona, which he often deployed when he was girding his friends and supporters for hard work ahead. He would warn them against naive optimism by noting that things always look darkest, right before they go totally black. So I will say there are glimmers of hope which we should build upon in civic education in the higher education space. To begin with, the public university reform I was asked to found at Arizona State University now has spread to a total of 8 states on 13 campuses, with funded mandates from state governments or boards of regents to establish independent departments, colleges, or centers of civic education. The most prominent institutions at which some such institute has been established are UNC Chapel Hill, University of Florida, University of Texas Austin, Ohio State University, and Utah Valley University. Secondly, miracles can still occur in our elite discourse. The Chronicle of Higher Education recently published an essay by 2 experts in this movement explaining that it is not a partisan ideological project from Republicans or conservatives, but rather is a renewal of classical liberal education blended with American civic education. Third, supplementing the prominent voices of Derek Bach, of Ronald Daniels, of the Educating for American Democracy report, the leaders of Stanford and their civic education initiative recently warned in the New York Times that, quote, by abandoning civics, colleges helped create the culture wars. And under the leadership of the Stanford Civics Initiative, Stanford University now requires a course entitled Citizenship in the 21st Century for all graduates. Johns Hopkins, under Ron Daniels' leadership and the Agora Institute he launched, has joined Stanford in establishing what they call a democracy education requirement. The Institute for Citizens and Scholars has launched College Presidents for Civic Preparedness, noting it is the responsibility of higher education to provide students the critical civic skills to participate effectively in a democracy, to engage in civil discourse, and to express themselves responsibly. Stephen Smith of Yale argued in his 2022 book, Reclaiming Patriotism, that we should follow Tocqueville and Lincoln, and also the American founders, to recover what he calls an enlightened patriotism of head and heart. Brooke Manville and Josiah Ober, in their 2023 book, The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives, urge a renewed priority for civic education. It is one of 7 essential conditions of democracy necessary for citizen self-governance. I'll only mention 2 other books by elites in our culture, and not conservatives. Richard Haas, his 2023 book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. And Jeffrey Rosen, who's speaking at BYU not too long from now. Jeffrey Rosen, director of the National Constitution Center, his book out this year, The Pursuit of Happiness, on the classical moral and civic virtues that leading American founders wrote about and practiced. And last but not least, Yuval Levin's extraordinary book published this year, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. Yuval's book is a masterclass on understanding the rationale for and the civic wisdom of our constitutionalism, if we would only think about it and rediscover it and try to understand and work within the Constitution's plan. I wish his book was required in every college and university in the land, and certainly required for every future civics, social studies, history teacher. The kind of civic education I saw at the U.S. Air Force Academy, offering that to aspiring military officers, that blended education in the head and heart, blended liberal education and American civic education, this is what must be restored across American higher education. We can blend Socratic discourse and disagreement with gratitude for the American constitutional order, which makes not just free speech, but education itself so widely available and so secure for so many. And I therefore close with a Socratic but patriotic question. Congratulations to Brigham Young University. It's already exceptional for its required American Heritage Course requirement for all graduates, and for having the Wheatley Institute, and for having the Constitutional Government Initiative. But, given America's circumstances and needs in 2024, what more could BYU do? And thereby, how could it be a model for other institutions? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. Let's open it up to the audience while I'm looking at the questions here. Let me start off with one, take prerogative here, and do one.
You mean I have to practice civil disagreement? Talk about it?
So, the first president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, talked about his love of the Constitution that he got at the knees of his grandfathers. Joseph Smith was born in 1805, so his grandfathers were alive during the Revolutionary period.
Lincoln is born in 1809.
So what role does the family have in perpetuating this reflective patriotism that you're talking about?
Wonderful question, crucial. Tocqueville, as a political scientist, so to speak, descends from another French philosopher, Montesquieu, who is distinctive for the complexity of his view of human affairs and politics to include culture and family and marriage and such questions as mores is the term that he uses. And if anyone knows democracy in America, you can see the very strong imprint of Montesquieu on Tocqueville. So we must, both Montesquieu and Tocqueville would say, that we must study these dimensions beyond government and laws explicitly. So what Robert Putnam is writing about is civil society, social capital. I was just trying to emphasize the connection between social capital really as civic capital and civic education. But I'm working on a book manuscript, and the subtitle of it is Reflective Patriotism in Schools, Colleges, and Culture. So I appreciate the question. Families would be the first, and for Tocqueville they are, the first place of education in all principles, moral principles, as well as civic and constitutional principles. So crucial, there's much work to be done. So it makes perfect sense that the Wheatley Institute is thinking about that range of issues connecting the civic, governmental, so to speak, on the one hand, with civil society, the family, religion.
Thank you. All right, so here we have a question from one of our students, Tessa Gordon, and she asks, what do you think we can do as students to perpetuate reflective patriotism?
Any other questions? Well, if you're at this lecture, that's a great sign, whether required or not. I'll be blunt about one thing. I grew up without these, and I thank God that I grew up without these. So try to look other people in the eye and find spaces and places to talk with other people, in classrooms, outside of classrooms, wherever it happens. And about anything, but especially about politics. And now that you've heard the theory of this idea of a virtue, an excellence, it requires hard work, a virtue of civil disagreement and of civic friendship across diverse views. You, as Aristotle would say, you only have a virtue because you practiced it, right? You practice being courageous before you are courageous, before you have the virtue. So to practice civil disagreement, we mentioned the Wheatley Institute. Is it the Wheatley Institute that's working with Braver Angels and ACTA, or is it another?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, there are national institutions trying to foster spaces, to use the terminology not in the way it was invented, a safe space for disagreement a safe space to hear tough ideas and tough conversations, right? That's what universities in general should be, places of high-level discourse and disagreement. So try to find the places on campus or off campus where you can do that. And again, you have to build up a thick skin. I did it with for 2.5 years intensely as the one conservative among reasonable center-left people who would tolerate me. And of course, I'd done it my whole academic career, but this, the stakes were big. We were issuing a national report, and I just had to, bite my tongue quite a lot and don't show that I was rolling my eyes at something that was said and try to keep, the diplomacy going to get across my point. Maybe we could use this word rather than that word. And so we were writing about civil disagreement and civic friendship across divergent views, and we were practicing it as a group. So I'm not suggesting anything mythical, impossible. It's not just a fantasy. But we all probably know of people who have done it, especially in Utah, more than most other states.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from Megan, a biology major. Often it becomes difficult to politically engage these days, and that difficulty has roots in being uninformed. With so many different opinions and takes on the same issue, it's hard to know where to turn for reliable information. How do you suggest finding reliable sources and forming informed opinions?
Wonderful question, thank you, and especially from a biology major, right? To be so interested in citizenship and civic discourse. Well, when I started my undergraduate studies at Middlebury College in 1985, they had just put electricity into the campus. And tough room, no, tough room. There was such a virtue, I look back on it. So I'm sorry, I'm now an old person, I'm 57. So you young people have to suffer with this, Back in the day, things were better. I went to the library. There was no internet. So that meant publications. You can read Tocqueville's chapter on newspapers in Democracy in America. It's not a pretty picture, right? There were very partisan newspapers in the 1830s. People who hated Andrew Jackson and people who loved Andrew Jackson. But there were editors of some sort. And then certainly by the 20th century, there was a professional culture of journalism and a public intellectual culture of editing. So sure, there were, partisan and ignorant things published all the time in newspapers and magazines and journals. But there were editors. It took some careful work to get something into print and published and distributed. So I would go to the library every day as a political science major, getting a liberal arts education, and I would be looking at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and some monthly magazine or weekly magazine that had been edited. So it was not as much just plain garbage as you find on these devices. So you have to do that sorting and preventive skeptical work yourself in figuring out what the more reliable, rational sources are. And then my second recommendation is find other sources, daily or weekly, of a view different from your own about politics, civics, culture, religion. So for years, what I've recommended to students is to look at a clearinghouse aggregator called Real Clear Politics, which curates every day opinion pieces, news stories, video clips, center left to center right. So you get some sense of the spectrum of the day's news reporting and journalism and opinion sources, all in one place. That's just a good place to start. And you might find, they've got National Review, and they've got something from the Center for American Progress or from the Atlantic, right? And then you might look at those websites as well. So it takes hard work.
So David, a BYU employee here, has a question. He says, early in your message, you briefly referenced love in your description of elements of reflective patriotism. It reminded me of Arthur Brooks' book, Love Thy Enemies. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on what you feel the importance of love is in our constitutional order.
I'm going to talk in James's class, James and John, teaching a course on constitutionalism, principles and development of American constitutionalism. And a crucial figure for me in understanding our form of self-government is George Washington, who isn't thought of by professors as a crucial source, because he's just a dumb general, and he was very tall. But he was a more thoughtful man than our academic culture gives credit for. And so it's fascinating to look at how, as he had the advantage in a sense of not going to college, but being very smart. And so he's not ashamed to use words like love of country and the bond and regard he has for his fellow officers. And then in his first inaugural address for, these fellow citizens serving in the first U.S. House and the first United States Senate. So friendship and love and that kind of emotional bond, to see him talking about it regularly. And this is a tough guy. Bullets whizzing by him and horses shot out from under him or they're dropping dead from exhaustion because he worked them so hard. Tough guy. But to talk about love of fellow citizens and love of America and gratitude for America. And I was mentioning to Brad Wilson earlier, having been the founding director of this department at Arizona State University, there was no model in the country for this. The closest model was the James Madison program at Princeton, which was not a separate department. So I was pretty tired after 7 years of doing that. My wife was absolutely sick of it. And as a George Washington scholar, I began to think differently about Washington writing to Martha and also saying in public, I would like to go home. Right? So his marriage with Martha as a crucial foundation of the fact that he could. And she's a devout Anglican Episcopalian. And he's always going to church services with her. There are all these kind of debates about whether he was a believing Christian. But in the home and in his marriage as a crucial foundation for the love, the patriotic sensibility he could have in public.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. So Tyler, a political science major, asks, how can we as Christians blend a disdain for contention and anger with the fierce defense of civic virtue and patriotism in our modern dialogue?
Wonderful questions. Lincoln I mentioned, right? But Washington. Lincoln is known, as George Washington is not, for his sense of humor, right? And for his capacity to try and go along and get along within the Republican Party, across the aisle to Democrats. Because that's how parties were. He was very much a party person. Parties were coalitions. Constant negotiating within your own party and then across party lines. But Lincoln was a pretty tough guy, right? So to genuinely be able to say at the end of the first inaugural, we must be friends and not enemies. And we must, restore and renew the bonds and recover the better angels of our nature. That's genuine, but preceding it was an unrelentingly logical constitutional political argument about why the secession was not only illegal, unconstitutional, but totally unjustified, right? So there we go. And within his own cabinet, having to deal with he picked them because they were all more experienced. And he defeated most of them for the Republican nomination in 1860 for the presidency. So to have the disagreement on his own cabinet and be civil and reasonable, but still be the boss, right? So those are two wonderful examples. Washington, I'll just finish with this. Richard Brookhiser's book on George Washington, Brookhiser book, Founding Father, it's easy to find the title of it, published in 1996. Wonderful character portrait of Washington. Talks, as many others have talked, about his anger. He is a big man. He's a proud man. He's got a chip on his shoulder because he didn't get to go to college. He's always trying to prove himself. And when his temper did erupt, Thomas Jefferson gives an account of it in a cabinet meeting. It was like volcanic anger. Grown men were afraid, okay? But he basically had learned to control his anger and his spiritedness and his temper. And he wanted to hear disagreements and different divergent points of view. He wanted Jefferson and Hamilton in his cabinet. Even after it's clear they disagree with each other, he wants them around. So controlling himself, trying to hear out different views while still having very strong convictions himself. So again, it's not mythical. And this was not, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill in the 1980s, right? Two very divergent political philosophies about America, but having a basic regard for each other. And it wasn't phony, right? They knew that that's what America needed to be self-governing.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Carrese.